a window of. Okay, cool. Welcome everybody. Thank you so much for in a lot to join us for this Android 11 meetup on a really lovely Saturday. I'm one of the co-founders for GDG Edmonton, and welcome you all to join our event. So just before we get into our really excited part, we want to have a little bit introduction of who are we. So I just took a screenshot from our website that we are our official chapter of the GDG community, and we are about a year old. Right now, more than 300 members, 12 experts, and 18 volunteers, and we're looking forward to expand ourselves to become the largest developers community in Edmonton. So if you are interested in our chapter for being a volunteer or being a speaker, please just click, this is our link for our website that you can just find more our information. And this is a picture of Edmonton for someone who has not been Edmonton before. That's our new bridge. We're in a pretty, north, but also really beautiful city. So I hope to you can come to visit us in someday. So just a quick overview of our today's agenda. So after the introduction, we're gonna have Rohan, who will do a presentation about what is new in Android 11. And Rohan is a second-year master student studying machine learning in University of Alberta, but also he is an Android advocate and also a really experienced Android tutor for the past few years. After that, we're gonna have Etienne from the a GDE, which is a Google developer expert, who we're gonna have a hands-on demo on Android Jetpack Compose. And after that, we're gonna have a Nav from GDG Montreal to do also hands-on demo on in-app review API. After that, we're gonna do an online survey and also a lucky draw. Then we're gonna wrap up our today's event. So without further ado, let's have Rohan to do a quick presentation about what is new in Android 11.
Yeah, thanks, Shindy. I'll just start to share my screen now. So, just tell me if you can see it. Yeah, okay. So, yeah, hello, everyone. Good afternoon, good evening, whatever your time zone is. So I'm going to give you guys an overview on Android 11 and some of the new features and how is it different from Android 10. Okay, so here's the agenda for this part of the presentation. I'm going to give you an overview of Android in general, the operating system itself. Then move on to Android 11, give you an overview of Android 11 and what's new in Android 11. And as a bonus, I'm also going to talk about how is it different from Android 10, what are the improvements. And then Etienne will take over with Android Compose and Nav will take over with the app rating API. So yeah, let's get into it then. So Android in general is a mobile operating system, but it is also used in other platforms, for example, your smartwatches, Android Auto, for example, in your cars, and also like home appliances and also your tablets. So it's totally Linux based. Linux is a kernel. It's not exactly an operating system, but it's something that you build operating systems on top of it. And Android has the largest market share in the world in terms of mobile OS. And for developing Android apps, you can basically use anything from like starting with Java. About 2 years ago, 3 years ago, Kotlin was introduced. Kotlin was made an official language to develop Android apps. You can also develop apps using C++ if you want to leverage the native functionality of any operating system or any hardware in specific. You can also use C++. It's called the Native Development Kit. You can also use Flutter, which is another excellent framework developed by Google. And if you are more of a Microsoft guy, and if you are familiar with like Visual Studio, and if you work with Visual Studio a lot, you can also use C Sharp with the Xamarin Framework to develop like cross-platform applications. You can also develop like Android and iOS applications with that. So yeah, a lot of like possibilities and flexibility there. So yeah, and it's like really nice. So moving on to Android 11, it is the 18 version of Android. It's currently beta. It's about to be released in September, which is like the third quarter in 2020. And it's like a weird thing, but before Android 10, everything was like named after some of the desserts, and it has been stopped now for some reason, though it's sad. But yeah, so Android 11 is the 18 version of Android, and in this version, like there is very heavy AI integration when compared to the previous versions, and you can have more accessibility with your voice. You can like do a lot of things with your voice, and don't have to like use your hands and do some stuff with it. So I was actually watching a video from Marcus Bonley on YouTube, and he was like going through some of the progressions of like opening up a Chrome tab, posting a tweet on Twitter, and doing everything with it with his like voice. So it's like really cool. And so you also have like customizable notifications, a lot of like segmentations, a lot of grouping and all that stuff. We'll talk about it in this part. And currently it's available for Pixel phones and some of the other phones which like support stock Android. But as like time progresses, it will also be available to other phones as well. Okay, so that's like a general overview of Android 11. So what's new in Android 11? So we're going to talk about input method editors, which is the IME. We're going to talk about conversations, bubbles, 5G, which is like really exciting. Um, Also external devices control and media controls. So just don't like freak out with all those things, but we'll go into more detail. So talking about IME animations are nothing but like the input methods. For example, your keyboard, your touch, and all that, the haptic feedbacks and all that. Um, so this is an example where if you click on the text box, the keyboard shows up. But another example is like this one where you can like drag on your screen, and the keyboard actually has an animated flow where the keyboard goes from the bottom to the up. It like shows up. Um, so in Android 11, IME animations are like more developer centric. So developer has more control over how the keyboard shows up, and it gives you like more flexibility on how you develop the application. So even if you don't want to use the default animation for the keyboard, you can use the app specific, or you can configure the keyboard to show in a specific way inside the app. So different apps might have different animations in terms of showing up the keyboard. And it's like a piece of luck. If you're not interested, don't worry about it. But yeah, some good to know. Okay, so conversations is like is a new feature in Android 11. So what happened is that in the notifications tray, Android 11 has like grouped all the real-time messaging notifications into a group of notification called the conversations. So if you see on this picture, so this is where the conversations description is given, and in this section you have like multiple notifications for multiple apps. So for the first one, it might be Twitter. For the second one, it might be SMS. For the third one is the Facebook Messenger's messaging app. But everything, even though they are in different apps, it's like grouped under one specific section. So some things you can do with conversations in Android 11 is like you can prioritize some of the conversations. So um, if you want to like mute specific things, you can mute them. You can make Android 11 give you some conversation or some notifications more than the others. So basically prioritize them. And you can also like convert the notifications into bubbles, which we're going to see in the next slide. And so, yeah, it's like one revamped version of the notification tray. Currently, it's being only used in or supported for apps that support or that are built for real-time messaging, for example, WhatsApp and Facebook Messenger, SMS, and all that stuff. And I'm not sure whether it has been included in email. I don't think it is, but yeah, currently it's being like only um, made specific for real-time messaging apps. Okay. So bubbles. So let's look at bubbles that we talked about in the previous slide. So notifications can also show up as bubbles, and you guys have used bubbles, but we don't actually know that it's called the bubbles. And in Android 10, it was a developer option, and in Android 11, it's like default, so you can like directly integrate it into the framework while you're developing the application. It's better than the system alert window. So what is system alert window? In like older Android phones, about like 2 3 years ago, if you are like trying to reply to a WhatsApp message, and if you don't want to open the WhatsApp application itself, the system alert window shows up on your lock screen itself with the message, with the name of the person who messaged you, and there's a text box where you can like type in the message and like press send. So you don't have to like open the application itself. And so system alert window is good. It's lightweight, but like bubbles are better. It gives the user a better user experience. It is a bit on the heavier side. It uses like a dedicated activity for itself, but it gives you like more control and better user experience in general. Okay, it does requires more metadata in terms of like making sure you have all the information needed to like create a window thing and then like actually simulating the application in a lightweight manner. It's not as heavy as a default activity, but like just a bit lightweight. So if you don't know what an activity is, it's just like the first thing that you see on the screen when you open an application. So if you open, let's say, WhatsApp or Facebook, so you the things that you see, the names of the people, the contacts, and all that stuff, the feed and all that stuff, it's just an activity. It's just basically a screen with some resources that has taken from the hardware. Okay, that's just it. Okay, and yeah, so that's basically what the bubbles is. We're gonna show about, yeah. So this is an example. So you might recognize this like from the Facebook Messenger bubbles. You can like it's called a chat head in terms of Facebook Messenger, but yeah, it's the similar concept. So why is it good? Why should you use bubbles? Bubbles is like you can basically use the same code for each and every real-time chat application, and it's like really good. So in this case, there's an example where you simulate a SMS app using a bubble, even though it's not Facebook Messenger. So you can basically use it for anything. And since it's like some sort of a template code, you can replicate or reuse the same code for different applications. So that's like one of the new features in Android 11. Okay. And so let's talk about 5G. Not so much, but just an overview. There has been a lot of like buzz around 5G. I will only focus on the positive ones, and the negative ones haven't been scientifically proven yet. But anyways, so um, 5G technology and the all the telecommunications companies have been like looking into 5G and how it can revolutionize the internet connectivity and all that stuff. So Android 11 does have a lot of support for 5G applications, and obviously if you have 5G, your experiences will be faster. You will be able to download like videos very quickly, even better than your like home Wi-Fi or the Ethernet. And for example, if you're like developing games and you need to like download assets dynamically, you can also do that with 5G. And there will be no latency issues because 5G is like really fast. So yeah, and also it has like bandwidth estimation. So bandwidth estimation is like the amount of data that you require in order to download like a asset for any application you're developing, for example, a game. Okay, so that's 5G. So the next thing that is one of the new features in Android 11 is It's this feature was there in like previous versions, but it was monitored through a separate application. Now controlling external devices, for example, your thermostat, your lights, your Google Home, maybe. It can like directly be like controlled from the mobile phone itself. You don't have to download a separate application, so it's integrated into the OS itself. So the way you do it in like at least in Pixel phones is you long press the power button, and you see like these normal tiles that you see here. I don't know if you can see my cursor. I don't think. Yeah. So, oops. Yeah. So like these things, these cards that you can see here. So you can like adjust the lighting, adjust the intensity of the lamps and all that stuff. You can also control blinds and all. So yeah, like as more external third-party devices are added to the IoT ecosystem, the Internet of Things ecosystem, like more control will be, you will have more control over these external devices through your Android phone itself. So Android 11 has like more support for Internet of Things platforms and all that development stuff. Okay, and the last thing that we're gonna that is one of the main highlights of Android 11 is the media controls, and this is one of the important highlights. So previously, all the media controls. So let me just like give you an overview what the media controls are. Media controls are nothing but just a way to control your media. I know that's not a good explanation, but for example, if you're using Amazon Music or like Spotify or something like that, or Google Play Music, um, if you run the app in the background, the play pause button might show up on the it does show up on the notification tree, right, as a separate notification. uh, so if you like maybe clear that notification, your music stops playing and the app gets like stopped. Also, if you can like if you like remove the app from the recent apps section, you if you like close the app, the music stops playing. In Android 11, what they have done is, first of all, they have like moved the notification the for the musics and all into the quick settings. So if you have an Android phone, you can like check it right now. So if you like pull down from the top the notification tray, you have this like the Wi-Fi symbol, the Bluetooth, the flashlight, and all that stuff. But it doesn't have the music, the media control section. So what they have done is they have integrated the media controls into the quick settings. So if you're an Android 11 user and if you like just pull down on the notification tray, you will see the quick settings and the media control section. Also, what they have done is like pretty good, I think, is given you multiple application support, and for each application you have a different section of the media control, and you can like swipe through them using like if you see down here you have like different dots, and where you can like swipe to the right and get a new application or access a new application, even if the application is stopped in the background. So that's like really excellent feature, I think. And you can like if you stop the music, it remembers where you stop the music, let's say at like 2 minutes and 50 seconds, and if you like play, if you hit play, it will start from the 2 minutes and 50 seconds. So it's like really nice. Also, you see that on the top right in the notification in the media control section, you have like pixel buds, so you can directly change the streaming destination from the notification tray itself. Okay, so it's like really nice. This is one of the features that I really liked. Okay, and so yeah, that's like one of the not one sub like some of the highlights from Android 11 that are like that stand out from the other versions of Android. Okay, and so let's like talk about some improvements from Android 10 apart from the features that I mentioned. So there has been a recent craze in the tech industry about foldable phones. I mean, about like 5, 6, 7 years ago, there were like these Motorola flip phones where you had the keypad at the bottom and the screen on the top, and you could like flip it in order to close it if you want to close it. And yeah, so like real now, what they have done is they have these like foldable screens and all. So if let's say you have a phone and you can, if you want to fold it, then the screen folds itself. There's like a hinge at the middle of the screen where the phone actually folds. So it's like OLED screens or something like that. So it has Android 11 has support for foldable devices. It also has like a hinge angle sensor if you wanna trigger some actions based on the angle of the how much you are folding the device. So you can also use that to develop like new features and all. It also has a revamped recent apps section. If you have an Android phone right now, you can like try it out. If you like go to the recent apps, there won't be like many options to like do with the recent apps that show up. So now in Android 11, you have like the ability to take screenshots from the recent app sections of that specific app. You can also like select text on these like the area or the preview that is showing in the recent apps, and also you can like share among with your friends and contacts. So that's like really nice, and that has been like incorporated in the recent app section. So you have better support for curved displays. So I don't know if you guys know, but like a long time ago, there was like a new phone called the Samsung Galaxy Edge, I believe, and it had like curved screens um, at the edge of the phone, the display of the phone. So it's just like a waterfall, so it like goes to the side, and it's like really cool design. And I don't know why a lot of people didn't use it, but I thought it was like really cool. So now with Android 11, you can like specify which sections of the screen are actually interactable. So sorry, interactive. So for example, you're developing an application, and if you want to place a button at the edge of the screen, the place where the screen actually goes down or has a waterfall kind of shape, um, the curvature, you can maybe place a button there on the screen and maybe like separate the keyboard from the button itself. So it's like really cool. So it gives you like more control over how the different buttons are like placed on the screen. So you also have like wireless debugging, which is like a really cool feature, especially for developers, because previously, if you wanted to develop an app, you had to like connect your phone, connect your Android phone with like a USB cable to your computer, and then deploy the application over the USB. So now you can like do this wirelessly. You have to just connect your phone to the same Wi-Fi network as your computer is, and you're good to go. So it's like really fine. And also the last two things that I want to talk about is the incremental ADB installation. So in terms of more specific to the developers, um, if you have an application, let's say of size 3 GB, right? So you don't want to wait for the whole application to be installed and then you start up the application and then test it and all. So it's not like it wastes a lot of time. So incremental ADB installations, what they do is they um, installs only a part of the application that is just needed for starting up the applications. For example, you only need like 100 megabytes to start up the application, and it will install 100 megabytes and do the rest of the things in the background, and you can like use the application like really quickly. You don't have to wait for all the 3 GB to be installed. And some of the newer phones have like very high refresh rates, the screen refresh rates. So for example, I think one of the Asus phones have like 90 hertz or 120 hertz refresh rate. So in Android 11, you can like set the refresh rate for different applications. So for example, if you are developing a video playing application, and if the video is like 60 hertz, 60 frames per second, you can set the refresh rate for that specific application at 60 hertz, regardless of the default Android refresh rate. Same goes for like if you have like a 120 hertz phone refresh rate for all the like the common the stock display, you can like set it to like or reduce it down to 30 hertz or 60 hertz or 90 hertz depending on the application you want to develop. Obviously you can't go above 120 hertz, but yeah, you can vary the refresh rate. So that's like a very new feature if you want to like have more smoother animations and all that stuff. Okay, so yeah, that's like from my end about the new features on Android 11 and how is it like different from Android 10 and some of the highlights. So yeah, that's from my side, and maybe Etienne can take over from here. Okay, thanks.
Cool. Awesome. Good work. Good recap. I even There's some things I hadn't really looked into yet. I learned a few things, so that was cool. All right, so my name is Etienne Caron. So I'm here to present a small intro, beginner's intro to something called Jetpack Compose. So quickly, I should mention that part of the reason I can actually go and give these talks, well, the big reason is actually that I get the support from Google through the Google Developer Experts Program. So what the program is I used to be a GDG organizer myself. I started doing a lot of talks, and after a while got recruited into this program where Google just effectively sponsors you to be able to go give these conferences. This used to mean something when you had to travel places a little bit more, but they also provide a lot of support and a lot of access to engineers, which is actually the really super valuable part of this network. And that lets me share it back with you. So I have to thank them and I try to do so at every occasion I can. I also want to thank my employer. We are on the weekends, but my employer does let me take some time to prepare these conferences and do these talks. And they've also sponsored this a few times as well, these speaking efforts. So I have to thank Shopify, my employer, for letting me be here today. You know, if you're Canadian, you probably heard of Shopify. If you're interested in the company, there's a lot of different openings there. So I'm also happy to to forward your interest. So let me know if that is indeed a thing. Now that I've got that out of the way, let's start talking about Jetpack Compose. So what exactly is this Jetpack Compose? So if you're aware of Android development in general, the developing UIs is not necessarily a very simple thing. So Jetpack Compose is the latest effort to try and upgrade this experience. Let me make sure I'm presenting the screen because I'm not, am I? I had this idea. I was on Zoom, so it's a different little setup. Give me a sec.
It is on the right bottom corner.
Right, let me just try it. Yeah, that's good. I'm just like, you know, navigating in my mind between the different versions. So let's try this out. Can everybody see the screen?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah? All right, cool.
Yep.
Awesome. All right, let's get this underway. Wait. What's going on, Mac? Interesting. All right, there we go. All right, so Jetpack Compose, what is it? So it's a new way of building UIs on Android. It's inspired in a lot of ways by what you have available on Flutter and React Native. So it's in Developer Preview 2 with Android 11. Right, so what features does this new system provide, right? Why are we even looking at a new way of building UIs? Well, the promise is that we'll be able to do things with less code. So if you're aware of how things work right now, there's a lot of XML definitions and you have to write code that taps into these XML layouts, interacts with them. So that's usually pretty labor intensive, especially if you compare it with the newer paradigms. So we're just, like, this library is trying to adopt these new paradigms and give us a bit more power there. That should also make UI building more intuitive. It should, generally speaking, accelerate development. It's more powerful. So these are like a little laundry list of features, right? So to get a better idea, well, today we're going to look into like more deep, but this little animation sort of gives you the idea of what kind of flow you're going to get into when you're starting to develop these Compose UIs. What you will be doing is programming in Kotlin what items you want on the UI, and every time you're basically adding a component or changing style, like here, press the little refresh button and you can see right away, without recompiling your whole app, how that's going to look like. So we're going to get through the basics today. We're not really going to deep dive, first off because we don't, you know, it would take multiple hours to do so, but also since it's a developer preview library, it's just not necessarily the best idea to like commit to it 100% right now, right? There's actually people that have been shipping code with this in production and the returns are good. But the thing is that these kind of libraries can change on a dime. So that you can end up committing to a certain approach that will be invalidated with the next release. So yeah, if you're happy with that, then you can start experimenting with Compose. Now, as a part of the talk, we're going to jump into a live coding demo. So you should still see my screen, and please yell at me if that's not the case. I'm pretty sure this is all good, but all right. So What we're going to be doing today is just going through those basic samples. Before I do that, though, and it's something we discussed with the organizers, since this meetup is not necessarily Android dedicated, I did want to give a very quick idea of how we used to develop things. So we're just going to look through an old app of mine and sort of give a feel of how did it used to be to develop UIs. I'm not going to get into the big details here, but here we have a to-do app that's running in the Android emulator. So if you're familiar with Android, this is a new feature. The emulator is now hooked into Android, one of the Android Studio panes. I kind of like this because it avoids having to alt-tab out of everything all the time. So right now we're running this to-do app, and I'm just going to show you a little bit what the XML layouts used to look like. So for the screen that we're seeing right now, it used to be, let me see, this is the one now. Right, so, well, anyway, you can sort of get the feeling of what kind of code you had to write in XML, right? So if you look at this, to define the whole frame that I'm using, I had to write all these things. I had to say, I want a toolbar here, I have an app bar there, I have a coordinator layout that knows how to lay out things, and inside of that, I'm gonna give it another block of UI that's gonna lay out in a different way. And if I go see this content frame, and look at what it looks like, I believe it was tasks activity, right? Anyway, so the idea was you would define everything in XML, and that's not so bad. Like, people would get used to that. Once you knew how to define layouts and put gravity in the right components, you'd end up with something kind of nice. The problem is that XML is fairly static. So whenever you ended up in a situation where you wanted to use your program to control what was on screen and maybe change your UX dynamically, you'd have to start operating on this document that was in memory, right? Like, so you can think of it a little bit like the DOM from Chrome or from the HTML browsers. Effectively, you have this object in memory that's been inflated from an HTML that's been created, and then you'd start programmatically poking in there. And that's not necessarily a very easy or intuitive way to do things. So I'm going to stop there for like how things used to be. And then this gives us context as to why would a new way of working be a little bit more interesting. And of course, I'm aware that if you're a Flutter developer already, or if you're doing React Native, this is nothing terribly new. But if you're not doing these things, what I can say is that Compose is pretty much the future of defining UIs. You have other libraries that exist also even for iOS. Yes, go ahead.
I have like minimal experience with Android, so I wanted to know what is XML?
Right. I'm going to answer that question, but for the remaining of the questions, if it's possible to do it at the end, just to, okay, that'll be easier, but I will answer that question because it's an excellent question. Now, XML, if you're not familiar, I think most people are familiar with HTML. So XML is sort of like an abstraction on top of that. So I'm just going to jump back to the XML file itself. It's a way of defining data in a structured fashion that's similar to how HTML lets you like sort of make things and organize things. So you can recognize a little bit of this because you're using something similar, right? Like we're starting these tags here with the lesser than sign and then closing them off. So these are fairly close to how you would define HTML, right? So HTML is like a, I don't want to say anything stupid, is XML the superset of HTML? Anyway, so they're basically, if you look at the inheritance, right, one is inheriting from the other. So XML and HTML are effectively part of the same family. And in the sense that you define tags in between these, you open and close these tags. So if you look here, we have a tag called app bar layout, and it's being closed very much like an HTML block right there. Even the IDE lets me collapse this because it's effectively one tag. And then you have this concept of attributes. They're a bit more wordy. You can see that there's this Android in front, but effectively, this kind of document could be rendered by your browser if the browser had enough information. It's kind of the way to look at it. All right, I'm just gonna skip ahead to other things. I'm gonna go back to our Jetpack Compose demo. So, right, at this stage, how do we define UIs in this new programmatic way, right? So XML was a data file that's being read by Android and rendered into a screen. Now we're writing code, and that code is going to become our UI. So to start off, everybody starts off their first program with a hello world. So right here, for people who are not familiar with Android, I'll touch really quickly on what is an activity. If you compare it to the browser world, an activity would be a web page, in the same sense that when you first load a web page, it loads the HTML, it looks into it to see if there's any JavaScript to execute. And once everything is loaded, it's going to start running this JavaScript. You can make a rough equivalent if you've never done any Android for the activity in a web page. An activity is sort of the piece of program that's being loaded up and that's going to show content on screen. And there is this idea that for each new page you load up, you have one activity, and that activity has this life cycle. It's going to start, and it's going to load whatever it needs to load to render something on screen. And when you leave the activity, there's also like a whole management of saying, okay, we're leaving this activity, we're going to the next screen. There's a lot of technical reasons behind that, but without getting into the detail of it, if you think of it as an analogy to how web pages work, it's fairly similar. Okay, so at this point, we have this one first function that's being called when we have an activity, and that's where we write our little start of our program. So when an activity is created, well, we do a little bit of calling the parents so that the parents do their magic. Like that's Android framework. Most people don't go and look into that code. You don't necessarily need to know what works, except that onCreate is the first thing that is called when your activity is going to show up on screen, when your page is going to show up on screen. And so if you want a UI in there, the first thing you're going to do is call something like set content. So in Compose, that's like a Compose specific function. As you can see here, when I highlight the set content, we get like a lot of documentation as to what set content is and what can it do, like this, like so. So set content is expecting to receive something called a composable function. So now, if people are not familiar with Kotlin and everything else, I'm going to not deep dive too much into you know, the nitty-gritty of how functions are annotated and all of that. But the idea is that the reason we're passing these little curly braces here, these lambdas, is that we're defining a function, and we're passing that function into another function called set content. And in this function, we're going to add more functions that define how our UI works. Right, so the first one is text. This is, if we hit F1 on this, we're going to see the documentation. We see that the text function has all these possible arguments that we can pass in. But the first one, the most important one is a string. All right, so we're going to pass in the hello world string as we could expect. I'm going to start the program here and to show you what happens. We're going to get an app, and in there we get the little world, hello world, the word, the text label here, hello world, displayed up top. Now, at this point, if you remember the GIF I showed earlier, I'm not doing anything super special. I'm starting the application, I'm running it. It takes a little while to compile. My program was a bit bigger, it would take a longer while to compile. So we're not yet seeing Compose in action as far as like the developer experience is going. So give me 1 second, we're gonna adjust that. So first thing we're gonna do before we get to that point where we have this refreshable layout without executing a program, we're going to look into what if we want dynamic content. So if what we can do with Compose, which is actually kind of hard to do with traditional Android tools, is create our own custom views very easily. And the way to do this is to create a composable function. In Kotlin, fun is the keyword that defines a function. And here we're going to call it greeting. And we're going to pass in as a parameter a name of type string. And in this function, what we'll do is that we'll actually define it to be another text label, pretty much like the one we had above. Instead of saying hello world, we're just going to say hello name. Right. So if you're not familiar with Kotlin, this $ followed by the name of the attribute that we passed into the function, the parameter, that's the way to refer to things in string. If you're only familiar with Java and Android, this is a lot more compact, a lot easier to write. Okay, so now if we run this program, well, we better call the greeting function here. And now this is it. Like the thing that's interesting is that this greeting function, we've just created a custom component of our own. If you know Android, traditional Android development, creating your own custom components is quite a feat in the sense that you need to know how to like see the sizing of your layout. You need to do all sorts of calculation. It requires possibly hundreds of lines of code. And here we just create our new component with like 3 lines of code. All right, so we're going to call that, and then we're going to say hello GDG Edmonton. All right. So if we run this as we'd expect, hopefully we're not going to get a crash. Last time I did this demo, somehow this crashed the app. There we go. Hello, GDG Edmonton. Simple enough, right? Cool. Now, I've been talking about this workflow that's kind of annoying. I have to restart the app every time. So how can I avoid this? Now, the reason we had to restart the app every time at this stage is that effectively to do a preview, to run a preview in the preview pane, so I'm going to hide the emulator here. I'm going to show you the preview pane right there. We have to be able to compose our UI without having dynamic attributes in there. So the way to do this, and it might sound a bit cryptic the way I'm saying it, but I'll just show you with an example. It'll be a bit more obvious. So I can use the preview annotation. That's another Compose special annotation. I'm going to create this function right below that, which is going to be preview greeting, or I'm just going to call it preview because we're going to move away from the greeting in a few seconds. So this preview function is composable. It's annotated with the preview. And then I'm going to say, OK, cool. I want to call greeting again. And I'm still going to, greet Edmonton here. And we're just by doing this, if I do the build and refresh as it is recommended by Android Studio, what's going to happen here is that we're going to get one build, but a quick build that only focuses on the preview, right? It was pretty quick to execute. And we see in the preview pane the text label with the right name and everything. So if I wanted to go back to Hello World, then I could do this, just hit refresh. And after a second or two, there we go. We have Hello World again, right? So with a very small app, you might not see the time difference, but if you're working on a slightly bigger app, compiling it can easily take a few minutes. So this is a really nice way of just working on a UI and just quickly iterating on it. So we're going to add new things, talking about, like, this is not super impressive. Right? It's just this one little text label. So we're going to start working on a bit more interesting stuff. So I work for an e-commerce company. So the typical example would be we want to sell product online. So we're going to create a product function. And for this product, we're going to start with, let me look at my notes. Yeah, we're going to start with something fairly simple. We're just going to give it a name, right? And a description, very straightforward. Those will all be strings. And yeah, we'll start with that and we'll add more as we go. So, you might think, okay, cool. Like, so what we've seen so far, if I asked you, you'd be like, okay, cool. So I guess I just need to add a little text function that's named. We're getting the red squigglies here because I forgot to put the composable annotation in front of everything. So in case you're wondering and you know a bit more about Android, composable is what tells the compiler to do its magic so that these functions become UI components. If we don't do that, then that doesn't really make sense for the Android Studio and the Android build system without it. All right, so then we're going to add a little bit of text with the name, and then we're going to put the description in there. And we're going to change our preview to actually point to our product, right? And we're going to give it some name and description that makes sense. A bit like the cooking shows on TV. I have all my data pre-populated somewhere just on the side. So I'm just going to copy paste what I have right there. Poof, all right, there we go. So that's what we have. And if we do this and rerun the preview, right, we'd expect to see something nice and just see the name and the description and everything is, whoa, what's going on? Yeah, everything is just laid up on top of one another. So what do we do now? Right, so we need to give instructions to Compose so it knows how to lay things out. Now, if you looked a little bit at the XML I had earlier, there's a lot of attributes in traditional XML Android UIs where you tell it how to lay things out. So it's not a surprise that we have to explain to the rendering system, to the UI system, hey, this is how I want you to put components on screen. Thankfully, though, it's pretty simple when we come to compose. So in this case, let's say we want to have things in a column, one on top of the other. So we just call this column function. We add this column function in there. And inside this column function, we're going to give it the text and the name. And if I hit refresh here, we're going to see all goes well, that we've relayed things out in a bit more sensible manner. So there's no overlapping components anymore. That's cool. It doesn't look like much. So we're going to work on this and try to improve it a little bit. So let me just check my notes a little second, because I tend to do this thing where I just run off into the night and forget about a few key points. I'm just going to double check my notes for a sec. Cool. Yeah, I followed the script this time around. So that's nice. All right. That's right, columns. So what we're going to do is start playing around with different column attributes and add a little bit of padding to make it look a bit nicer. So the way to do this, you can see the column function here. Now, if you're not familiar with Kotlin, I'm actually going to take 1 second and, okay, it doesn't want to give us the documentation. I can jump into the actual source code of the column function. So if you're not aware of Android in general, Android is an open source platform. So what's kind of nice is that for the most part, whenever you look at functions that are provided to you by the Android system, you can actually go and see at the source code. And this is what we're doing here. I just clicked through the column function and I jumped into the actual Google source code for it. And you can also see that there's a long block of documentation. I'm not going to read this to you, of course. The main point I wanted to point out, the main thing I wanted to point out was that we can pass in a modifier to this function. And you might be also wondering, if you haven't seen how Kotlin works, like why in this we're not doing more something like column and I don't know, modifier followed by some composable function. So the trick is that with Kotlin, if the last parameter of your function, like here, is this child, this children, these children, and in Kotlin, you can actually pass in functions as parameters. And when you do so, you can actually pass that function in as this notation. Like you're basically, wait, sorry, right here. The column function we're calling in, the last parameter we're giving that column function is this lambda block here. This is a function that takes no parameters, and that it's going to match the signature of this thing right here. So if you're not aware of Kotlin, these things might fly a little bit over your head, but if you are aware of how Kotlin works and you've worked with extension functions and functions, this is sort of the magic sauce behind a lot of what Compose is doing. All right, so let's go back to this. We wanted to add a modifier to make our layout a bit nicer. So we're going to pass in a new modifier attribute or parameter. So we can create that one by calling modifier, and modifier has this function called padding. Modifier class has this other function called padding. And for the padding, we're going to go with, I'm just going to look at my notes. What was a nice little layout here? I put 16 dp originally, so we're going to go with that. 16.dp. And now Android Studio is telling me, what is this modifier? We have to import things. So if you're new to Android Studio will autocomplete a lot of stuff for you if you know the shortcuts. So this is what I'm doing right here. Now, another kind of little weird thing, if you're not familiar with Kotlin, you see I define a number here and I do .dp. That might be a little bit of a weird syntax for you if you're not used to it. Again, you can click into things if you're just working with sample code. So in this case, I'm going to click onto this dp keyword. I can see here that somebody's defined this dp function that will take an integer and turn it into something that makes sense for the Android rendering system in this case. So this is the kind of little tricks that you can pull with Kotlin. Kotlin is a language where it's very easy to create what's called a DSL, so a domain-specific language. That means that you can take Kotlin and extend it to add your own little functions, your own language constructs, and make it your own. So Compose uses this extensively to keep things really neat and tidy when you're programming. That's also part of the reason it's so easy and simple to work with when you're familiar with it. So at this point, we've added the padding. I'm going to hit refresh quickly, and we can see in the preview pane here that if you can look at the sides, we have a 16 dp padding around the column. I'm going to just make this fit the screen. Yeah, we're good. It fits the screen perfectly. This one. All right. So on its own, it's text. It's not super compelling, so it might be nice to add an image or something like it. Thankfully, I have that waiting in the wings. So we'll just quickly add that. So just like put these parameters in separate lines, so it's going to be a little bit easier to read. So in Android, you have image descriptors. You point to images using IDs, unique IDs. So typically what you'd pass in is this, something like this, an int, right? And this is an image ID. Since that's not really super descriptive, what Android has as a system is that you can put little annotations on parameters to tell it, okay, this int is actually a drawable resource. So that will tell the Android system, okay, we're not expecting just any regular number here. We're expecting an ID that points to a resource in the system. And so by doing this, Android Studio is going to make sure that we use the right type of reference here. So it's just a nice little way of enforcing type on something like a very basic value, right? Like a primitive value. All right, so we're going to add an image here, and this is, so I already have these images ready to go. So using the Android system, we do r.drawable, and then we have the list of pictures that have been made available here. If you're not familiar with Android, this is going to sound a little bit weird, and you're not going to follow too much, but effectively what happens with Android is that these r drawables are made available because there's this predetermined way of organizing things in the resource system. If you see under the folder drawable here, I have these 4 drawables, these 4 JPEGs, and they're available to me in the code whenever I use the r.drawable.something. So you can see here that the IDE is proposing to me these images. So we're going to use the front of the album for this. And now we want to add this new image to our column. So how do we do this? It's a bit more involved, but not that terribly much. So we need first off to get an image from the system using that ID. So to do this, what we first do is we're going to create a new value, a new attribute, and it's called image asset here. And we get this by using a system function called image resource and giving that image ID to that. And this function is going to, I'm making a little mistake here. What is it? Oh yeah, I need to be specific as to what type of parameter I'm passing. That's all. This is odd. I'm making this mistake. I'm not sure I'm getting. Let me just double check my original source code here. I probably just made a typo in there. Anyway, so moving on. So we have an image asset now. So this is like a proper image. If I specify the type explicitly, in Kotlin you don't always have to do that, but you can easily do so. You can see that image asset is an object of the type image asset. Pretty straightforward. And then that's the type of asset we need to pass into. You probably already guessed it, image composable function. So this image composable function, where I'm going to put the image at the top, I'm going to add that image asset as a parameter in there. Also, I have to import that image. So I have to pick the right type of class, the one from the Compose system. And by adding this image, I can hit refresh, and it's going to probably look awesome, right? Wait, this crushed everything. Our text is all squished at the bottom. The preview pane's all weird. This image is like weirdly off. It takes up all the space. Again, it's just that we need to add more formatting attributes to this for it to make sense. Cool. So what do those look like? Well, a bit like the column right here with its modifier, we have to pass in a modifier to the image for it to know how to lay things out a little bit better. So we're going to create this new modifier object that's going to specify how this stuff works. So just to organize my code a little better, I'll create that here. So it's an image modifier. It's going to be equal to. Now, what's interesting here is that you might note that the modifier class is actually the same one that we're using for column, right? So that's kind of interesting because it means that we're going to have like a bit of a common way of defining how things lay out. So that's already a hint that it's a bit easier to do this kind of stuff with Compose than it used to be in the past with the XML I showed you earlier. So right now we're going to add a few things. So we're going to say that this image has a preferred height, and we're going to make that max height. Let's see, going to be a max height of preferred height in this, and max height of 160 dp. So this is like obviously stuff you always look up in the documentation that you get familiar with as time goes on, right? Like it's not worth looking into every single little function definition to see what all these things do, but it does give you a feel for how easy enough it is to do things. We have another function here we can apply to our new modifier object that's being created here, and we can chain that call with a fill max width. So we're going to say basically we want to limit the height of the image. We want it to take as wide as possible that it can, and that's going to be it for the modifiers. Now we do need a little bit of something else if we want it to look nice. I'm just going to skip ahead and just add that right away. We're going to make it crop the image so that it sort of fits the width, but if it's square and the actual height we want is a bit more like landscapey, it's going to cut the image in the corner at the top or the sides, depending on what it needs to do. So here, the content scale attribute is going to be, the parameter, sorry, is going to be crop. We're going to make it crop. So if we do all this and we run the preview again, hopefully it'll fix most of the problems we had. Yeah, there we go. That looks much nicer. And as you can see, it cropped the top and the bottom of this image so that it would do a nice little landscape type effect, even though we're working with a square source image. Cool. So let's keep going. So we've done the image, we've modified scale, we've played around with it. Now the spacing of this is a bit off. So how do we put space between components? Fairly straightforward kind of stuff. Like we just add a spacer and we specify how big that spacer is going to be through the modifier class again. And that modifier is going to have a preferred height of, in this case, we're going to put 12 dp. If you're not familiar with what a dp is, imagine a pixel that's screen density dependent. I mean, it's kind of a smart height that will scale depending on what kind of device you're using. On Android, you get like a ton of different screen sizes, right? So this helps us specify a size that will be sort of constant, independent of what type of screen we're looking at. Cool. So if I add this little spacer, I hit refresh, nothing crazy, but we should see a little bit space appear between the image and the text and the description. Title and the description. All right, cool. So what else can we do with Compose? So at this point, we're going to start looking into something called material design. So again, if you're new to Android, Android has this design system like a lot of mobile platforms have, and that design system is called material design. It's pretty much a Google-backed system design, and this was invented back in the day because effectively Android developers all over had no design sense. And contrary to Apple, who always had sort of recommendations on how to do layouts, and like Apple has in their developer documentation, or back in the day had something Android did not have, which was general recommendation on how to make an iOS app that looked like an iOS app. So this was sort of missing in the Google ecosystem. So Google went a little bit above and beyond and created this thing, the material design system, which is basically Google's design system and Google's design language, but it was configurable enough, if you will, to allow for different brands to sort of adopt it and put their own colors and their own spin on it. So it's this design system that's almost built for developers in a sense. And you can go to your design and say, okay, you're swamped, you're busy with the web design. How about you just give me a batch of colors and our corporate logos, and I can integrate this stuff into our apps without you necessarily getting involved, endlessly involved in the UI design. So it's kind of that thinking, because back in the day, honestly, I think the Android ecosystem in general had pretty nasty design on all the apps. So material design came along and people at least had a guideline to follow, even if, say, their own company did not have a designer. So that helped improve the look and feel of apps in the ecosystem. That's effectively what the goal was, I think. Anyway, that's my interpretation of it. I might be wrong on that. All right, so, material design. So how do we benefit from this, this stuff? So we have like a lot of packages and classes that come along for the ride when you use Compose. Like you can see them here, it's a bit tiny, but these components are already material design compatible. So we're gonna add a few things here. So what the first thing we can do, material design says things like, when you have an image, it's nice to have clipped round corners. So we're gonna do that first with our image. So how do we clip an image? It's actually fairly simple to do. We go back to our image modifier, and we're gonna call the clip function to add that configuration into the modifier object we're building here. And we're gonna tell it, okay, cool, we want rounded, we're gonna take a rounded corner shape. So this could be used to both define a clip area or define an actual rounded corner shape that we want to display on screen. But here we're providing it as a mask into this image modifier. That's like a nice, interesting concept. We could provide other types of shapes and they would be used to clip the image differently. All right, so if we take this rounded corner shape, we're gonna give it something nice and obvious. Like it would probably be too much for a real design, but I want it to show up on the stream really nicely. We're gonna give it 18 dp of rounded corners. We're gonna rerun this. And there we go. Like you can notice here that we have rounded our corners. Cool. So what's next? Like material design has a lot of specifications. We have specifications for theming text. So we're gonna do that right now. So if I look at text, let's just start making our text a bit more interesting. So we're gonna go to our text composable function. Since we're starting to add attributes to the function call, I'm gonna add named attributes so that the system knows what we're talking about. If you're not familiar with Kotlin, again, I'm floating a little bit here. If you can see the text bubble, the help bubble, you can see that there's like at least, like 16 different parameters that we can pass. So when we start adding some in, especially if we're jumping around, we have to name them for the system to know what the heck we're passing in. So the text name is the text, and we're going to give it our first style, and our style is going to be a style. We can get styles from an object called typography. Typography is an object that's been created ahead of time right here. So it's an instance of the typography type. And as you can see here, we defined a couple of specific ones, but there's also baseline types that are baked into this typography object that come along for the ride. So here we just effectively customize the body one type text. We're not even going to use that in our example, but that typography object basically defines styles that will be shared across the application if we want so. All right, going back here. So the style typography, we're going to specifically take header 6. So if you're familiar with HTML, it's very much like an H6 type tag. So we do this, we rerun our preview, and we should see our title just, basically become an H6 typed title. Cool, so we're gonna play around with a few more things. So what do we wanna do with the text here? We're gonna add a few things more to the text. So we're gonna, first off, we're gonna style it with body typography, body 2. So you see body 2 is the default Android one. It's not the one that I showed that was customized. So we rerun this, and I think the rerunner is not started. Okay, it'll be subtle, but we'll see that the text will slightly change. It slightly got a little bit bigger, the spacing changed a little bit. So that's the first thing. Now, we might actually not, it's a product listing, right? So if the product listing goes on and on and on forever, we don't necessarily want our product card to go all over the place. So one thing we might want to do is just basically force the height of the description field. So what we're going to do is we're going to specify that max lines in this case is going to be something like 3. And when we go above these max lines, we're going to specify what kind of behavior we want. So I personally like when there's little ellipses at the end. So we're going to say if there's a text overflow, you're going to use the type ellipsis, right? If you're not familiar also with Android Studio, or if you are, you can see that we get the full power of Android Studio suggesting a lot of the valid answers right there, right? So there's a lot of this that's like, even if I'm not super familiar with Compose, like all the suggestions that are accurate and relevant for our current cases are always the things that show up in the little text boxes. So it allows for one to become really quick with all this stuff, even if they're not super familiar with the APIs. Right, so if we have this now, I run a refresh, we should see that this text here is being clipped and we see the ellipses at the end. So that's nice. We're happy with that. Cool. So that sort of gives you basically like the ideas around state management. Not state management, sorry, I'm getting ahead of myself. Material design, assigning stuff. So I'm just gonna do a little bit. I'm not sure how good we're doing on time. Let's just pause a sec. So are we good on time? How much time do we have left for the, like, anyway, somebody stop me if we're going over, right? Like I have like about 15 more minutes, I think, and I can skip ahead on a few things. But what I would like to show people is a little bit more interesting of a design, right? Like we can reuse this product card. Because a big point I was making at the beginning was that effectively you can create your own UI, all right? So if we've created our product right now that I'm highlighting, like we, just to show how powerful that is, I should, just show you what happens when we create a couple more new products, right? That's kind of fun. So again, with a cooking show analogy, I have like the product function calls already defined. So I'm just going to copy paste those. And let's see there. So just to go quickly, and let's copy paste this stuff here. Just gonna relay out everything nicely. So I've added an extra card. So if I hit the refresh, we'd expect both cards to basically show one next to the other. It's going to be, oh yeah, of course, right? Hey, column. So let's add our column, right? I was just like, you probably saw me coming a mile away with this one this time. All right, so running this again. And there we go. That's kind of nice. Except, well, we probably want some sort of divider in there. By chance, is it? Oh yeah, there you go. It's called divider. What do you know? So we'll pass in a few things. So we'll just say that's black, and we're gonna, modifier again, same kind of pattern. So we're gonna use the modifier class and add some padding. We're gonna keep that padding really subtle, but just like, just to give an idea again how quick that is to do stuff. So if I hit refresh again, we should see a little divider appear. It's going to be a bit clearer that we have product cards. So right now we can see like all the layout lines and all of that. So that might not be super practical. So there's a couple of things we can do. Like if we want to see our preview in action on the device, we can then hit deploy preview. Now I might be wrong about this because I'm not actually super experienced with Compose, but I believe that it's not going to compile a whole app. Right, it's just going to take the preview and put that up on screen. And you can sort of see that because there's no top bar and everything. So it's interesting to actually see that you can put that code on your emulator and start playing around with it without necessarily having the whole Android framework of your app around it. Now, that doesn't sound like much if you have a very small app, but if you're working on an app, say like the one I work at work, which we don't use Compose, of course, but it's a bit too new, but our app is huge, right? It has like dozens of modules and different types of screens, and I don't know, like something like 80 contributors on it. So it's not always obvious if you need to test a UI out to recompile this thing. It takes about 5 minutes, I think, and just to see if your one screen is working. We ourselves have internally built tools, because this app's been around for a while, to be able to do something similar to this. Effectively just starting a separate UI with nothing connected behind it and just testing things out. So that Compose offers this now inside the Android ecosystem right off the bat. That's really a powerful feature. Anyway, so we can see that without the little layout lines, we can see that this is looking pretty decent, really, for a little effort, for a live coding effort. So I'm just going to hide that emulator pane again and hit the size up button here so we can see it full screen. All right, so we're pretty happy with this. Now, earlier you might have caught me talking about state. So state is actually the next thing we're going to talk about. So what do I mean by state? Well, UIs are showing live data, right? In this case, we're working with entirely hard-coded stuff since the beginning. As it happens, state management in Compose is how to put this. I think you could definitely say that it's come along a ton. And I believe from what I hear from folks that the way things are currently in the developer previews for Compose is pretty close to what we're going to see released at the end. But the thing is that the examples out there and the tutorials have not really followed up with all of that because it's been under a pretty heavy state of flux. So it's definitely possible to find a lot of information on how to hook your UIs up to like standard Android architecture patterns and not so standard ones as well. But well, first off, it's a bit beyond the scope of today. We could get into this huge rabbit hole, but I'm going to show a demo of how things sort of work with state management in Compose, just so that you get an idea of how you would eventually hook that up to a proper data source that refreshes itself, and where you get asynchronous data sources as well. Things kind of get complicated, but just to show you and talk a little bit about how Compose deals with mutable state and how that works, right? So we're going to do something that's definitely not best practice, but that's perfect for this demo. We're going to add a little piece of state on each of these cards. So what we're going to do is, to start with, we're going to add a button to each of these cards, and it's going to just be like a button that you can heart or just show that you like a specific album. And so each card is going to have a copy of that button. So we're going to start off with adding the button itself, and then we're going to see how to define the state that goes behind it. So we're going to take this component that's called an outlined button. I was talking earlier about material design. So what I'm going to do very, very quickly to sort of like really make that explicit, like material design outlined button. And that should bring us to the card right there. Material.io is the material design website that talks about everything. So right here, we see all the different types of buttons that material design recommends people use. We have text buttons, we have outline buttons, and outline buttons, in fact, is the one I'm using right here. And if we looked, we could, there's a contained button. If I go back to our example, I could add, these classes are one-to-one. So if I button, I believe that one was in there. Why is it not? I lied, apparently. Okay, the one I do know that exists is the text button, so I'll use that one. But it might not be a perfect one-to-one, but the Compose team is definitely trying to match the material design spec with the button names. So if we added instead of text button, we'd get the same look and feel as we get on that website. Anyway, so going back to our outline button, what we're going to do here is just give it, so on click, this is the code, the function that's going to execute every time somebody clicks on the button. And then underneath that, this is the actual content, the function, the composable function that tells us what we have inside the outline button. And you might be like, wait, what? We add content to a button? Yeah, we actually add text. It's not super intuitive. That's how that sort of works. So what we're going to do is like add a little bit of text, and actually that text is going to be, let me just, okay, so I'm going to add, like, I like to use emojis in these buttons. There we go, a little heart. Oh, there we go. Go away, little display. Okay, cool. So we're going to, a like count, right? So we're just going to go like, we don't have this like count yet. So let's just see how we're going to, like, where we're going to get that from. So we're going to add that right now. All right, so this is where you're going to get the first hint on how state works in Compose. So we're creating a new value, a new attribute. And this value is going to be a like count, as you would expect. And the way that you define that is by using this function here called state. Now, there's new ways of defining this in the later developer previews, but I'm not going to get into that because I want to keep things nice and simple so you get the general idea. But be aware that this stuff is under heavy state of flux, and this is also why there's not a ton of tutorials out there, right? So this will likely change, but the general idea of the approach is going to be, whoops, it jumped up there, is going to be valid. So we're going to call this function state, and we're passing it a function again, which is kind of like, oh, that's that. And in this function, we're just putting 0. If you're curious, we're not going to deep dive into this, but you can jump into the source code again and look at it. And then you can see that without going into too much detail, the key point is that it's using this remember thing. We don't know what that is, but the key point is more this. It's going to take the function that we passed it in, this init function right there, which returns type T. So what that means is that the 0 we passed into the function is this thing that's being returned. You could also have like a complicated bit of code that calculates what's the initial value of the number of likes we have on this button, right? So that might give you a little bit of a hint how things are going to work in a more complex example. But the idea being that this thing creates a complex object that knows that you're starting with a value X, and that every time it changes, it's going to do stuff. It's going to do something. So what is it going to do? We're just going to focus on the results, not on how it works under the hood. But here we're creating this state. We're giving it a state of 0, and it's creating this like count. Now, this is not an int, right? So I'm going to add the specific type, the explicit type here, just to be very, very clear on what's being created here. We're creating something called a mutable state, and it's of type int. So it's basically this wrapper around an int, and it tells the composable system, this is a thing that changes, right? That's cool. So we're not, if we want to display how many clicks we've had so far, what's the actual value of this mutable piece of state, we have to access the value attribute of it, right? So this int is held into this value attribute right there. And so to actually make that come alive, what we're going to do is that every time the user presses on the button, we're going to take the like count and that value, and we're going to add 1 to it. So we do a ++ on it. Right. So every time it clicks, we're going to increment this value by 1. Now, the magic bit here is that because this is wrapped in a mutable state, that's going to create the loop where every time the value changes, Compose is going to know it changed, and Compose is going to smartly detect that it has to update what? It has to update the text label on that button. So let's try that out and see if it works. Also right now, take notes. I'm rerunning the preview. I'm telling it, refresh the preview. That's interesting, right? I'm not telling it, recompile the app, none of that. So I'm rerunning the preview, and here what I'm going to do, and I hope it works this time, because honestly, sometimes that does not work, and I think it may be a bug that I encountered in some of my live coding. But here what I said is I clicked on the button that says, let's start an interactive preview. You can see up here it says stop if we're not interested in it anymore. Now, normally what we should see is when I click on this, and then, yeah, for sure it doesn't work. Just like yesterday. I ran into this problem as well yesterday, where it didn't necessarily work. But what I'm going to do, just to do the demo a bit more proper, I'm going to try to refresh again, see if that helps. But so this didn't work. What we'll do is we'll just stop the interactive preview and actually preview it in the emulator where I know it will actually work. And once we have that running, I'll just hide this for now. Right, so once we have this screen, and again, no real code behind this except the Compose itself, but now that we have this running into the proper emulator, every time I click on one of these things, it increments the like count for the product card that we're working with right now. So that's sort of like a hint as to how you'll be able to hook your UIs to a model behind the scene. So I'm going to go one level more complicated with state, and then we're going to stop. So I'm going to show you how to do something called hoist state up. Now, I'm a bit talking through my hat, as we say in French, which I don't think is an expression in English, but effectively, I'm showing you stuff that I think is already sort of half deprecated. Like you shouldn't be really managing state the way I'm showing it to you. But it does serve as an example of how the idea of how you work with state is going to be interesting. That hoisting state, what do I mean by that? I believe if you do Flutter, you might be familiar with the kind of terminology. I talked with someone I know who's doing Flutter, and they told me this is a pretty common concept. But the idea is that you want to take that piece of state and you want to make it like bring it one step up into the tree. So what we're going to do here is to do that is that we're going to take our like count and we're going to turn that into something a little bit different. So what we're going to do instead is that we're going to turn it into one global clap stat. Like basically we're going to say that all these things belong in the same product category somehow, although that music, those two albums have nothing to do with one another. But we're going to say that basically if anybody claps for the music that's in our list, they clap for all the pieces of music in our list. So we're going to change the emoji here just to represent that for a little Wow. There we go. Boom. Cool. And we're gonna change the code here to make it a little bit more. So what we're gonna do is that we're gonna pass into the product the piece of state that we want it to listen to, if you will. So if we want that to happen, the best thing would be that we just give a shared count int this time. Notice this is not a state I'm passing in. I'm going to pass in like an actual int. And the other thing I need to pass in is that if I want something to happen every time a click on the button is made, I'm going to have to pass in a click handler that's been defined somewhere else. So instead of doing my own click handler here, I'm just going to go like, I'm going to receive something called a click handler. I'm going to define that at the top. And if I want to pass in a click handler, I'm going to pass in a function. So this function will take in as parameter a single int, and it will return something called a unit. So if you're not familiar with Kotlin, a unit is a void. It's basically nothing. It's basically a fancy way of saying this function takes in an int and returns nothing. Right. So by doing this, now I have to go a bit higher up. So the click handler right there, that should be, why isn't it like this? In a sec. I'm just going to double check my code samples. Oh, right. So no, that's, yeah, I'm sort of getting ahead of myself a little bit. We're actually going to call this function update shared count. Okay, it's not necessarily a click handler. The update shared count, whenever you call it, you're going to pass in the int that updates the shared count. It's a bit clearer if I do it this way. And then here, I will call this function from the click handler. It's subtle, but it's different. What I'm going to do here is that I'm going to update the shared count every time a user clicks by taking the current value that I know, which is shared count. And then that shared count, I'm going to add 1 to it. I'm going to call this function, which I do not know what it does, but I have to assume it updates something. It updates the shared count I received. So here, since we're not using the mutable state anymore, you can see that there's nothing that tells product it should refresh itself. We have to go up top for that. So now we're missing that parameter. So I'm going to add that quickly. And I'm just in the interest of time, I'm going to copy paste a little bit and cheat here. So, right. So at the top of the preview function, I'm going to add this shared count that I've been talking about. Same pattern here. It's a state 0. It's, if I explicitly say what type of type it is, you can see it's a mutable state int. Under that, I create an inner function called update shared, which, as you might have guessed, would take an integer as a value. And then whenever I get this function is called, I will assign that to the value of shared count. What's interesting here, like if you look at what I'm doing, is I'm going to pass in the int, right? So this, and then not the shared count, but the value of it. So in and of itself, this thing does not update, right? It doesn't do anything. It's just an int. And then under that, I'm going to pass in a function, right? The update shared count. And this is going to be, if you're not familiar with Kotlin, this little colon notation is just basically saying, I pass in it, like take this function and pass it in as an attribute, right? Anyway, don't worry too much about it. Hopefully it's understandable. All right, so, all right, I'm passing these in for both. So the thing that you have to note is that the idea that this value updates is only known to the preview function. So what's happening here, I'm going to run the sample, right? I'm going to run the sample and I'm going to explain a little bit what's going on and what's this whole hoisting state about. So once I start this, the buttons will have changed and all the buttons are hooked up to the same data source. So when I press one of them, they both increment by 1, right? So what's happening here is pretty clear from the updating point of view. What's kind of the clever bit with Compose, and we're going to end on that, is that this shared count here, when it updates and it mutates, Compose is smart enough to realize that since it's being used here and here, it will need to recompose the UI tree. That's the magic bit with Compose. Like there's this idea there that when state changes, Compose is going to be smart. It's going to look at your whole UI tree and determine, depending on what pieces of state have changed, which part need to be redrawn. And this happens sort of naturally as you code. And yeah, with that, I'm going to end the live demo on this. So hopefully that was interestingly informative. If it wasn't enough, then you know, I sympathize, because there's a lot of stuff to know with Compose and to find out. So I'm just going to give you a few more slides that will help you find more information. So the first example I would suggest you look at, so basically what we've done here today, I've cheated a little bit. It's very close to the tutorials you're going to find on the Jetpack Compose site, right? So, but if you want to go beyond that first level that you're going to find on the Jetpack Compose site, this GitHub project is really great. It's not a Google-backed one. And as you'll see in a sec, there's other examples from Google where they deep dive into how Compose works, and that the team that makes Compose update constantly. But the thing that we're missing right now is this middle piece between the very basic tutorials and the very complex example Google provides. And this right here is the piece that you might want to look at. Like, I haven't looked deep into it myself, but I've heard a ton of good about this. So first thing I'd recommend you check. Once you've gone through this and you want to deep dive, the Jet News sample is really where to look at. This is one of the Google-backed examples that's built by their dev relation teams, and they're really good examples. Honestly, there's bits of it, I've looked through it, and there's bits of it that are still a bit of a mystery to me, but mostly only because all this stuff is being developed, and the content that explains all of this has not followed up with it. But I know for a fact that a lot of this stuff is being built as we speak, and there's more and more of it coming out as the summer progresses and Compose is hitting new releases. Also, there's some activity in their source repository, Google's source repository tree, that seem to hint that Jetpack Compose Alpha is going to come out. Like, we're in developer preview right now, but I think they're working hard on getting that into a developer alpha, or rather a first release alpha. Like, we're at 0.01 right now, and anyway, we're gonna hit 1.0 at maybe sometime this autumn. Don't quote me on that, but that's what it looks like. And then the last sample, if you want to do some fancy stuff, is this one. So it's called Sample Materials Shop. So if you know who Romain Guy is, he's one of the Google authors for a library called Filament. And Filament is a 3D library. It's like pretty fancy. It allows you to take very modern GLTF type files, which are like the new standard in defining 3D. It's a library that's behind AR Core. It's like a really nice library on Android that allows you to do a lot of 3D oriented things. And he's built an example where he uses that to make product cards inside this fake little e-commerce app. And it's really speaks to the power of how you can add very varied stuff in Compose and how far you can bring it. So I find it's a pretty exciting example to look at. So I recommend you go and check that out. And that's it for me. So thank you very, very much. At this point, if you have questions, I will be very happy to field them.
Cool. Thank you so much, Ellen, for this such a cool and very, detailed introduction, and also the live demo for the Compose. I think, like, personally, I've learned a lot, and definitely, because I'm not an Android developer, but I can still feel you by like dummy for how you do UI in previous and nowadays. I think that's such a great improvement, and I think I'm gonna look into the few links that you mentioned.
Awesome.
And really appreciate it. And any questions for the audience? We can take about like 1 or 2 questions.
Yeah, I have a question.
Go for it.
Yeah, so like it's like more related to the, I would say, the Android Studio thing as an IDE. So I saw that you were having the preview thing, which doesn't compile the whole app, like
Right.
previewing the stuff that you like integrated newly. So I was like wondering whether it is only possible in the Android Studio IDE itself, or does it also carry over to when you're testing the apps on the phone?
So yeah, you saw that there was a mode that allowed us to run only the screen, the preview itself on the emulator. So I would assume that works also for the phones. Honestly, I haven't tried it. Also, now that you mentioned that, I forgot to mention something during this talk, is that if like we were using developer preview 13 right now. It's developer preview 2, number 13, whatever. I don't know what their numbering system's all about, but dev 13 is the library version we were using. And right now today, dev 16 is the latest one that's out. And the thing that is, if you do play around with it and get into a bit more into the latest cut, basically, of that library, the preview will not work. The preview is broken in Android Studio. It's like a known issue, a known bug. And it's some of the stuff like that. As you play with Compose, you're going to find it's a bit rougher on the edges. That's why it's a developer preview. But it's worth noting that, yeah, it doesn't always work perfectly. And also, I think we're going to see probably even faster roundabout trips at some point. That's to be determined, but I think there's a lot of focus on that because the main pain point with Android right now in developing UIs is how, you do have previews for XML as well, but they're kind of janky. They don't always work very well. When you want to do custom views, it doesn't work all that nicely. So, the teams are really trying to fix that. And I get the feeling from the chatter I've seen that they're really focusing on it. So we should see something interesting with that. Like, I think we're going to be really happy with the results as developers. So if there's no other question, like you can also throw a few in the chat, and I'll be happy to either answer in the chat on the side while things are going on. Also, might be worth noting, I'll just link in the chat links to my own GitHub and my Twitter account. I'm often very happy to just answer questions. At some point, the code I showed today will probably turn up into my GitHub repository, and I'm happy answering questions through issues and things like that. So that's a way to contact me. It's going to be nice. All right. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you so much. And sorry, my background is a little bit noisy right now. Without further ado, we're gonna have our last talk of the day, which is from Nav Singh, who's a very experienced mobile app developer and has tons of experience. And also, he is one of the leads in GGG Montreal. So I'm gonna let yourself to introduce a little bit and welcome Nav.
Hi, thanks. So let me share my screen. Just
And by the way, I know I said this before, but I really like your background.
thanks for that. You see my screen now?
Yes.
Yep.
Okay. So just a sec. So yeah, today we will discuss about in-app review API. It's just announced here last week from Android team. So before discussing it further, I will introduce a little bit about myself. So I'm working as a mobile software engineer at Manulife and also organizer at GG Montreal. And if you guys like to stay in touch, I added a few links for my profile on Twitter, LinkedIn, and GitHub, where you can see the sample code that we're gonna see today. So yeah, before discussing the API, I would say like what was the challenge to introduce this API for Android team? So this is like the huge demand from Android community for the team, because it's really hard to get the reviews from users. So nowadays we see like this is a really challenging thing. Like nobody goes to the Play Store to leave you a good review. Like if user get frustrated during some process, like if they are doing some transactional thing in your app, or if they found something hard, then they just go to the Play Store and leave you like 1 rate or 2-star ratings. So so far we implemented rate this feature, like we are asking for rating through the drawers, or we are adding some kind of actions like but item in menu, like where we can just redirect them to the Play Store, right? So that was like really challenging, and we don't know if user really goes to the drawer and ever hit that button or give us a good rating or not. So to tackle those kind of challenges, Google team introduced a new API which is called in-app review. It's considered as a Jetpack's component. Like Jetpack has all other libraries like Work Manager and Kotlin Coroutine, Room, or many others like Lifecycle and all that stuff. So in-app review API, it has these three major components. We started with we need to get a review manager. It's a interface. It provides a review manager object, which helps us to start the in-app review flow. And once we have the review manager, we get the request task. And when this task is completed successfully, it gives us the review info object, and which we're gonna pass to launch the actual in-app review flow. And yep, so these are the main three steps. First we get the review manager, then we request for the request task, and then on the result of that task we get the review info object, and that helps us to launch in-app review flow. So for this API there are some constraints. It only works on Android 5.0 or higher, which is like API 21 and higher. So I think it covers almost 95% Android devices in the market right now. And the second is Chrome OS devices that have Google Play Store installed in their devices. So yeah, that's the little description of the details about the API. So if we need to implement, I already explained how it works, like what are the steps that we need to follow. So the first step is to get the instance of review manager. There is a review manager factory, and we just pass the context. It depends if you want to pass a application context, that would be the best practices. And once we get the review manager, the next thing is request task that I already told you. It provides us a review info object. So this is the code for that. Like once we get the manager, we request review flow, and it gives us the request, which is the type of task which has a return. On successful completion, it returns as the review info object. So this is the code. Like we check if the task is successfully completed for the request review, then we get the result, which is review info, or else we continue with the normal process. Like if user is doing something in your app, you will just continue with that. And the final step is review info object. When we get it from the request task result, then we just trigger the launch review flow on manager and passing two parameters. First one is the activity or the context, you can say, and the second is the review info that we got in the last step. And then the last step is we added the flow is also itself, it's a task which is returned by launch review flow, but it doesn't give us any information back. So the code in add-on completion listener, it will trigger anyway. Like it doesn't matter if it, like you don't get any information. This is like, I think there's restrictions from the play team. Like you don't know if user actually gives you the ratings, or user cancels the dialog, or user submit the rating, or they just dismiss the dialog when it appears. Or even if there is a quota restrictions by the team, and if those restrictions are not met, the dialog will not be shown to the user. But you will not, as a developer, we don't get any information. We just trigger and we just add our code after like add-on completion listener. So once that dialog, the process of the review is completed, do this stuff. So this is the code that we need to do for asking ratings through the app. But the cool thing is, like, we don't, like, they don't need to leave your app. It's everything from your app. You request that feature and it will pops up the dialog, and user within that dialog, they can give you the 5-star or whatever, and even they can write the review, and from your app they can submit that feedback, and it will automatically publish to the Play Store, that you can check on your Play Store account later on. So yeah, this is about the implementation. And the next thing is, like, always we need to test our code. Like we can't go without testing. So we'll see what they provide us in terms of testing. So basically they provide us 3 ways of testing in-app review API. The first one is fake review manager. And this is like you can test in your code base your review process, but I personally feel that it doesn't provide us that much solid testing in terms of actually testing the full process. So rather than getting the actual review manager here, sorry, yeah, actually we are getting review manager factory.create. It will give us the actual review manager, but when we are testing, we call the fake review manager. We get the review manager as a fake review manager, and from there onwards it will trigger all the way down to the launch process, and finally triggers the last step, which is add on completion listener on the flow object, and it just triggers the code that you entered in the last part of the process. So you can just say like if that process is works all the way through the end of your process. And it does not stimulate the UI, and it only fakes the API method results by always providing you the successful scenarios. Like it gives you the review info, it gives you the request of task, and it goes through the success flow of your flow when it's launched. And the second way of testing is internal app sharing. I don't know if you guys know about it, but there is a two testing tracks on Play Store. One is internal app and one is internal testing. And internal app sharing, I found it really useful, but because it simulates the flow as well as it provides you the UI, so you can actually see how it looks like to the end user. And you can but there is a one restriction, like you cannot submit the feedback through the internal app sharing channel, but at least you can see the full process, like when you go into that particular scenario, or when the certain conditions met that you defined, and then the dialog will appear, and it will, in this case, it will always appear. It doesn't matter like if there is no any quotas restrictions in internal app sharing channel. And third one is the internal testing track that I didn't add it in this one, but this is similar to the internal app sharing. So I tested first two methods, and it's a demo. So let me share Android Studio so we can see actually the code. You see Android Studio? Yep.
Nope.
No. Okay. Let me check. See it now?
It's loading.
Yes.
Yeah, there you go.
Okay.
The font is a bit small for me anyway.
I will try to large fonts. Just a second. Is it good now?
Yeah, that's very nice.
Okay. So yeah, so I created a sample app, and I had a main it's a two activities. So I write the code, like I late in it. If you know the Kotlin little bit, the late in it's like you are initializing it later on during your on create or whenever you need it. So I created a review manager variable here, and then on the on create, I initialize my manager here. So I check if I'm in the debug mode, initialize it with the fake review manager, or otherwise, like if it's a production code, I get the actual review manager. And this is the second step. You get the request flow, and if you see the definition of this, it gives us the task, or which is the type of review info. That's the object that we need to trigger our final launching the in-app review process. So I added the completion listener onto it, and then we added I used the when statement. It's from Kotlin. It's like a replacement for if else. So I check if it's a successful. Okay, grab me the review info object, and then I get the flow based on review info object and are passing the context of this current activity, but you can pass application context too. And then it needs the review info object that we received from our request. And then this is the final completion listener. So I added just a toast to show like how it's gonna work. And this is all the implementation side that you need. And even the testing is little bit it's a kind of integrated within your code base, which is not a good practices. But I hope they provide us a more independent way of testing this full process, because even in this case we are not able to test it. So let's test it. And they provide us the guidelines like you don't need to manipulate any UI, or you don't need to show any messages to the user before you launching the process. Like just leave it as it is and then go from there. You just need to trigger the event, and then it will automatically manage the whole process for you. Like, and they also told under the guidelines like you don't need to add this code on particular action. So let's say right now you have code in your code base, like under drawer you have a menu item like create this app, and from here you're redirecting your users to the Play Store. But now if you are implementing in-app review API, you don't need to do that kind of behavior with this new API, because you are not sure like when user clicks on this button whether it's going to show the dialog for rate your app or not. So if let's say you added this section in your settings and your quota is already limited and you already like the review is already done by the user and the quota is exceeded, then the event will not trigger the review flow, and that will be like a bad user experience for your users. So we need to avoid these kind of situations to like explicitly we don't need to trigger a review process on any actions like on buttons or in menu items. And yes, it's taking a bit time. In the meantime, I can show you the internal app sharing, like how it works in internal app sharing. So I already put my app on the internal app sharing track. So in this case, you can actually see the flow, like full flow, how it works, but they restrict us to the submit the review, but it will go through the full process. So this is the app that I already posted on the app sharing channel. So it will grab your information from Play Store, like your name or your image, and then your name of your app and everything from your Play Store. And you can give a rating or whatever you want. Let's say once you give the ratings, it will ask you for a review, and user can type whatever they want, and then they can submit or cancel. But as I told you, like in app sharing channel, they will not allow us to submit any feedback from here. But for testing purposes, it's a better at least from the fake review manager, which just all the way go to the add completion listener and just execute this code from here. So this is the second way of testing, which at least we can test the UI as well as our logic. And this is the code that I added here, like a make text and all that stuff. So yeah, this is all about the review manager API and the code. The code is like pretty small. I think it's just a couple of lines. I added this sample API sample code base on Git that you can check, and then that's it. There is nothing to demo in like actually in the emulator. That's all. That's all in the. That's all I explained to you here in this class, like how it works. And then you just need to post your APK or your app bundle to the Play Store or internal app sharing channel, and within a minute you get the link of your app, and you can share with your users or your registered testers, and they can easily test. You can easily test your flow, how it works. And the last thing is like under the guidelines, they also provide the quota. Like they don't provide any detailed description of that thing, but like how many times they're gonna trigger this rate review feature. But they said like they have their in their own site, they implemented some kind of mechanism, like how many times they're gonna ask to the user. So let's say maybe like Apple, they have I think 3 times in a 365 days. So something similar they implemented in this. And but on top of that, you can also implement your conditions. So let's say you get the request flow here successfully, right? And then when you try to launch the review flow here, you can add your some kind of conditions, like if app is launched 10 times, or if successfully user able to complete the transactions. Let's say if you're working on bank app, or and user is able to successfully complete the 5 interacts, you can put conditions of your own, like version checking if the same version APK is already. So that kind of conditions you can put on top of the quota that Google implemented by their own. And that's pretty much all about this API for now. Thank you very much. If you have any questions, I'm happy to answer that.
Yes, I have a question. Um, what happens when you don't have internet connection while you're providing the rating? Does it get stored somewhere locally, or you can only rate when you have internet?
So the first thing is like, let's say it depends like where you lose your connection. So if you initially lose your connection, it will not trigger the review process. So let's say you are in the app already, and when it comes to the here, when you try to launch the review flow and there is no internet connection, it will not trigger the process because it gets the information from Play Store. So your app, your account name, your account, like full details related to that process, it fetches from the Play Store. So if there is no internet connection, it will not trigger that process.
Okay, thank you. And I also have questions for the previous presenters, if I can ask that. Yeah, I have a question for Etienne. Um, I have a general question. Why would XML be a better option than HTML for user interfaces?
Well, I guess specifically in Android's case, like if you think about HTML as the browser renders it, right? Like you define components that are specific to browsers in a way, right? HTML is like made for browsers, and native interfaces can have, like in the case of Android, they implemented their own buttons, their own view items, right? So if you think about it, like the library of tools that you can use, like the UI widgets that you can use on your Android device when you're programming natively is very, very different from what you get into a browser. So in a sense, they sort of took the same approach, right? They decided, okay, we want to define our UIs through a document that looks like HTML because that has some interesting characteristics, right? They made the decision also, I think in 2007 or something, right? So back then it made a lot of sense to say, okay, we want something similar to HTML, especially considering how the devices were not super powerful back then. Like if you look really back like 10, 12 years ago, an Android device, if you wanted to have like a fancy UI in Chrome, it was almost impossible because you had like this application, a native browser with a really low resolution. And so it would not have made sense for them back then, especially, to really just let people write HTML and render that. Funny enough, though, if you look at 2008 when iOS, well, the first iPhones came out, you could not develop for an iPhone unless you wrote effectively a web app. Like you had to do it in HTML. And within a year, they changed that. So because historically what happened is that some people hacked the phones just so that you could write their own native code and exploit the phones a little bit better than the browser would allow them to, right? You couldn't write a game that would fit in a browser because you have these different layers effectively, right? Like where the browser is interpreting a thing, which is interpreting another thing. So you basically lose power as you go, because you have like an operating system on top of which runs a browser, on top of which runs your app. So if you think about it that way, that's why historically they started out with XML, because XML was just their own language for defining a UI. But you still had some of the characteristics that HTML would bring you, in the sense that you define a document, it's like structured in a very specific way. But I don't know if that answers your question, but that's kind of...
Okay, thank you.
Pleasure.
Good, thank you. Thank you, our awesome three speakers for all those really cool knowledge and a fun experience, especially for the demo part. So without if we don't have further questions, we're gonna proceed into our next agenda, which is post-event survey and also our lucky draw. So we have two Google Home Mini as our lucky draw prize for our event. But I will first of all send our post-event survey to our chat, and hope you can take like about 2 minutes, 1 minute actually, to fill it, to ask about your feedback. And also, I'm gonna let Vania to take over the lucky draw prize, and I think she is an expert on that, and she just loves it. Okay.
Hello, everyone. We are going to make the lucky draw for those ones who filled our entry survey. 1 second, please.
You're gonna share your screen for the lucky draw?
Yeah, 1 second. Here we have all our participants who